So good morning, good afternoon, Brasilia, Washington. No one is in Washington, but we are confident some colleagues will join us. Also from Warsaw, welcome Alex, and also the gentleman sitting to your right, Grzegorz. Okay, so today we're going to discuss audit quality. So. We all know that audits are very important. Following the most recent banking crisis, some voiced a certain skepticism as to whether audit was actually something useful, but as we could see, in particular here in Europe, audit is still something that policymakers believe is very important to provide assurance to the users of financial information that they can use this financial information for a number of different decisions. So auditors are what some like to call gatekeepers. They're very important. They help build the necessary trust that a society needs. Nowadays we see audits almost everywhere, not just in the public sector for listed companies, but also in the public sector. Here at the WorldBank we have no shortage of audits. Of course these are particular audits, but they still are here to provide assurance to the users, in this case on the proper use of the funds for intended purposes. So audits are very important, but I think we all agree that good audits are even more important. But what is a good audit? I guess we could answer that we know it when we see it, but the problem is with audits that we don't see it. We see some auditors generally dressed in black suits. We see some reports, which are very short documents, so we don't see a lot by way of audits. We see sometimes the results of poor quality audits. So I think in our experience, in our respective work lives, we may have seen quite a few bad audits, but it's very difficult to see and to define what is good audits and what is audit quality. But here today we're going to try to do that. We're going to try to define what is audit quality. This is something very important for us here in Vienna. This is something important for the whole corporate financial reporting agenda throughout the bank. We know there is a variety of factors, there are different ways to approach the question of what is an audit and try to answer it. But today, as I said, we're going to try to answer the question, and we brought somebody who we think is ideally placed to answer the question. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pascal, who is going to moderate this session. Pascal, over to you.
Thank you, Henri. I'm very glad today to welcome Jon Grant. I've spent a few days with Jon. We were actually working together in Czech Republic, helping the public oversight and the quality assurance system to try to understand better what is audit quality and see how the framework that has been designed by the IAASB with the Audit Quality Task Force that was chaired by Jon before, see how this framework could help them in implementing their models and establishing effective institutions. So let me say probably a few things about Jon. Many of you may know Jon. He's a former member of the IAASB, and I think he is very much likes to defend the profession that he had belonged for a long time, and also to try to find what is best for audit quality. So you have improved during your life, Jon, to design audit quality projects and strategies, audit methodologies, and also software. As I said, you lately led the task force for audit quality at the IAASB, and you spent several years there, if I remember well, about 6 years as a board member, and a few more years as in helping design the standards. And formerly, you were also a senior member of the Financial Reporting Council team, coordinating the FRC's regulatory activities. And then before, you were a partner in one of the big audit firms. Welcome. I think that this framework could probably help us doing a lot of different things. I think that you want to also see a bit more of this framework discussed in a broader audience, and I think that is a good opportunity to do that. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes of a presentation of the framework, and I will welcome questions to John or to us after that presentation. Without further ado, John, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Henri and Pascal, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Pascal, it's an absolute delight for me to talk a little bit about the audit quality framework. I don't know, Henri, whether I'm the ideal person, but Pascal is right that I've spent many years working in this area, and so perhaps I've got some useful information to pass on. Spending many years working in an area is a very polite way, Pascal, of saying that I'm very old as well. So thank you for not saying that. I don't know, can we get the slides onto the screen now? I think it's better to look at a few slides rather than looking at my ugly face for the next 20 minutes or so on.
There you go.
Thank you very much indeed. And the first slide really covers some of the ground that Henri has already covered. We know, don't we, that financial reporting is a very important aspect of stewardship, both for the financial markets and more broadly, and that audit adds credibility to financial reporting. But for audit to add credibility, it has to be high-quality auditing. And as Henri says, that there is trust that the auditors have done a good job, that we have audit quality. But what is audit quality? There has been, up until now, no universal definition or explanation of that term, even though it's used by many of us almost on a daily basis, and it's been the subject of extensive legislation and regulation around the world. There's a number of reasons why it's quite hard to define audit quality. Just a few of them are that, first of all, audit is very subjective. There are very many judgmental areas, and in all areas of judgment, it's quite hard to know whether it's good judgment or bad judgment, particularly as the judgments are made at the time the work is being done. Sometimes it's possible to challenge those a year or so afterwards, when a company has failed, but at the time that the audit's being done, not all information is available. And linked with that is a lack of transparency. The main output from an audit is perhaps a single-page audit opinion, and that audit opinion normally says all is well, fair presentation, true and fair view. It doesn't really describe how the audit's been done or what was found during that audit. And so investors have said it's very difficult for us to tell if the audit gives the company 99 out of 100 or whether it's closer to 51 out of 100. And people have been asking for more information to provide that overview. So it's with these things in mind that IAASB agreed 4 years ago, I think it is now, to start work on a project describing an audit quality framework. And we finalised that document in just December last year. So it's relatively new for us. It's not the only work that's being done on the subject of audit quality. And one project that is certainly something that I'm looking quite carefully at is work in the US, where the PCAOB has a project to try to measure audit quality. And they too have been working on that for a number of years. And I think they're due to publish what's known as a concept release on that before the end of the year, and that'll be very interesting to see where they've got to with their project. If I may just talk a little bit about the objectives of the project, and three of them are on the left-hand side of this slide, to raise awareness of the key elements of audit quality, to encourage discussion and to help the various stakeholders explore whether more can be done to improve audit quality. It's not designed to be standards. It's really what I would call a catalyst to help a discussion. And we hope that through that discussion there will be actions taken, different actions in different countries perhaps, but with the overall goal of continual improvement of audit quality. And the right hand of this slide is our best attempt to try and describe the framework in a graphical form. And I apologise for the quality of the graphics. We found it quite hard to get it all in a single picture, and particular apologies for the fairly lurid colours that we've got here. There are 5 parts to the framework, and the 3 in the middle, in the triangle in the middle, are fairly conventional. We have inputs, and we have process, and we have outputs. And many people who talk about quality in any field will talk about inputs and process and outputs. So that we've perhaps got some new ideas on, but the elements themselves are not new. Around the edge of that, we have a ring of red circles and the word interaction. And this is to try to demonstrate that interaction between all of these different stakeholders can be a very important mechanism for improving audit quality. We know, of course, the importance of the auditor communicating with the user and the limitations of the audit report. We're familiar with the auditor communicating with audit committees. But what about some of these other dimensions? What about management and audit committees? What about management and regulators? What about those charged with governance and regulators, and those charged with governments and users? So it's the multi-dimensional aspect of that we think can be very powerful, and we explore in more detail in the framework. And then right around the outside is another ring, the blue ring, where we describe a number of contextual factors. And these contextual factors are things like law, the accounting framework, the corporate governance regime, and so on. And these are likely to vary from one country to another and can have an impact on financial reporting and, because of that, an impact on auditing itself. And so we explore those in the framework as well. So those are the official objectives of why IAASB spent the time on the audit quality framework. My particular reason for wanting to be involved so actively in it is a slightly different one. For many years I've been involved in writing auditing standards, and I'm proud of what's been achieved in the UK and internationally, but I also know the limitation of auditing standards. There's only so far you can go by writing rules and guidance. And I'm conscious that some people think that just compliance with auditing standards will automatically deliver audit quality. And I've never thought that myself. I've thought that standards are a part of audit quality, but not the totality. And I thought this was a very good opportunity of explaining the totality. And it was a rather nice leaving gesture, I suppose, because we finalised this on the very day that I rotated off IAASB and retired. So it's a last word from me, perhaps. We talked a little bit about definitions, and one of the more challenging aspects of the framework was to see how far we could go to a definition of audit quality. I don't think we've gone all the way. We've made more progress in defining a quality audit from audit quality. So there's 2 concepts in here, and perhaps the easiest starting place is a quality audit. And in the middle of this slide we've got 5 aspects. We think that a quality audit is likely to have been achieved by an engagement team that exhibits appropriate values, ethics and attitudes, was sufficiently knowledgeable, skilled and experienced, applied a rigorous process and quality control procedures, provided useful and timely reports, and interacted appropriately with stakeholders. And you might recognise from those 5 things 2 inputs, 1 process, 1 output, and 1 interaction. So there's a link there with our framework. That's a quality audit. We think that audit quality is something slightly different. Audit quality, we think, is the regime that exists within audit firms and with countries to make sure a quality audit is always delivered. So it's a sustainable system for delivering quality audits. And we think that while the auditor is clearly responsible for a quality audit, we think that other stakeholders have an important role to play in audit quality as the broader concept. And that's one of the things that is of particular interest, I think, to oversight bodies in Europe as they struggle with trying to create the right control mechanisms for individual audits. So, not one definition, but 2 half definitions, if you like, a quality audit and audit quality. As I said before, the framework is not authoritative. It's not a replacement for standards. We still expect standards to be applied, but we do hope this document will be a useful catalyst to engage groups and to try to improve audit overall. We believe that the framework applies to everyone, that it applies to audits of financial statements and other types of audits. We think it applies to large audits and small audits, and large audit firms and small audit firms. And we think it's therefore a holistic framework that applies to auditors and stakeholders, whatever's being looked at. And we think that's a powerful thing in itself. The framework, as we saw in the diagram, has inputs, process, outputs, interactions, and contextual factors. But at the bottom there, we also demonstrate those at 3 different levels. The level of an engagement, a high-quality audit, and at the firm and national levels, audit quality. So we identify the various inputs and processes at these 3 different levels. Just a quick overview of that. We've got 2 main inputs. One, that auditors are exhibiting the appropriate values, ethics and attitudes. The second one being that they're sufficiently knowledgeable and experienced. Both of those relate to the people. We all know that auditing has to do with the people. It's not the process alone, it's the people. And therefore the ability to be able to focus on the people doing the work, I think, is absolutely key. The process, this is where ISAs and the quality control standards for firms such as ISQC1 apply. This is fairly well-charted territory because we've been working years for producing standards. But thinking of the ISAs, there are something like 500 requirements in the 36 ISAs. About 10 of those are relatively factual. That leaves 490, which to my mind are either dealing with aspects of judgment or need significant judgment for them to be properly performed. So judgment is absolutely key, and that's where the people come in. So you're back to, well, what are the values of those people and what's the experience of those people for the judgments to be properly made. We've got outputs, and I've already talked, and Henri has already talked a little bit about the audit report, but there are other outputs. Things from the audit firm, such as in Europe transparency reports. Things from the entity, maybe a report from an audit committee where they talk about some aspects of the external audit. And increasingly, of course, reports from independent regulators. And individually and in combination, these outputs are a very important aspect, both in increasing the substance of audit quality and by projecting the image of audit quality, if you like, not just the substance, but also the perception of audit quality. Now, the next slides I'll go through relatively quickly because they're getting down to the detail of what are the different factors we see within those inputs and those processes and those outputs. The book itself, describing the framework, is about 50 pages long and is a stunningly good read. And I'm sure you'll want to spend a little bit of time reading about the inputs and the process in detail. But these slides give just a little bit of a flavour for what's in there. And remember, we're talking about the engagement level, then the firm level, and then the national level. And the first input is the values, ethics and attitudes at the engagement level. And we've got familiar words in there like objectivity and independence and competence. It's that last one that I just wanted to pick up on, skepticism. Skepticism, I think many would say, is fundamental to an audit. But how can we be sure that skepticism is being applied in practice? Certainly in the UK, there is these days quite a concern within the audit regulation group that auditors are not being sufficiently sceptical, that an audit is becoming a compliance function. As long as the boxes are all ticked off, the job's done. And I just wonder if that is what's happening, well, what is the value of audit? Because to me, as I started my training nearly 40 years ago, we were motivated by trying to find something wrong. And that was where the quality of auditing came from, by finding something wrong. Now, just trying to finish the job and make sure that all the boxes are ticked can't possibly be achieving the main objective of an audit and can't possibly be delivering audit quality, I would think. We go down a level, if you like, so the same input, values, ethics and attitudes, but now at the firm level. And I'll choose just the second one in order to mention. The necessary personal characteristics are promoted through the firm's appraisal and reward systems. Now, we know that all audit firms have appraisal and reward systems. But what are they looking at? What are they rewarding their partners and their managers for? And in recent years, much of it has been to do with selling of non-audit services, commercial success. And it's a very interesting question for me, I think, to probe, well, where's audit quality on this list? And what do the firms mean by audit quality? How do they value their partners and staff? And I think just by asking these questions and looking around the room at audit firms and seeing their faces and seeing them increasingly look at the floor, it suggests to me that audit firms, at least some of them, are probably not thinking about audit quality and rewarding their people for delivering high quality audit. And I say that was, if that's right, and that was a major failure that needs to be acted on. And so the last level, we're now at the national level in terms of values, ethics and attitudes. The middle one again are regulators thinking about this when they're doing their reviews and so on. Are they active in assuring that ethical principles are understood and consistently applied? And I think there's again questions to be answered there. I think a reasonably good job has been done with the ISAs and promoting those around the world because they're relatively easy to teach. I think there's a much bigger question as to what is the enforcement regime for ethical requirements around the world. Enough, I think, probably on the inputs. We'll go to the second, enough on values, ethics and attitudes. We now go to the second input, which is knowledge, experience and time. Again, quite a long list. Again, I'll go for one in the middle. It's the fourth one. The audit engagement partner is actively involved in risk assessment, planning, supervision and review. The audit engagement partner should be the most experienced auditor in the team, and for a high quality audit to be performed, should be controlling what's going on. Historically, however, it's often the other way around. The work is planned by junior people, performed by junior people, and presented to the partner at the end of the day for his blessing, his or her blessing. And there are enormous difficulties with that because the time has gone. The partner might say, well, have you done enough work in this area? And there often isn't enough time to address it. So the timing of the involvement of the key people is absolutely fundamental. There's a little bit on that in auditing standards, but it's probably not as prescriptive as it should or could be. And it's, I think, something of interest to audit regulators to explore, well, where was the partner time spent and was that effective? Next level down, knowledge, skills and experience at the firm level. The middle one, are partners and staff involved in coaching less experienced staff? We're now talking about an aspect of training. We know that firms do traditional classroom training. People sit around, perhaps listening, perhaps not listening to what's going on. And people learn a little bit about auditing from classroom training, I think. But a number of us older people remember that we learnt not from classroom training, but by working with high-quality people within the firms, being coached by them, and sometimes being told off by them, criticised by them for getting it wrong. So you learn often by imitating people that you respect. And in the past, people at a senior level, I think, had the time in order to be able to coach the more junior staff. Time is a more precious ingredient these days, and it's less clear that that's going on. And so are partners and staff being encouraged to coach their people? Is that being measured? And are they being rewarded in any way for doing it well? I think is a good question. And then the last one, where the last of the inputs at the national level, the bottom one, just for something slightly different. We know that training is important, but it's sometimes difficult to train donkeys to become racehorses. The quality of the people that are recruited and retained by the profession is vital. And some countries are better at doing that than others. And I think it's something that all countries need to think about if they're thinking about audit quality. Is the profession as healthy as it should be? Are they recruiting what is sometimes termed the best and brightest people? And if they're not, is there action that can be taken to make things better? I'm looking at my watch and seeing that time's flying, so I'm going to accelerate a little bit. The process is more familiar territory because we've got the ISAs and other standards. Just to take the second one on this list, use of technology, we know that the large audit firms have very computerized audit systems these days, which may have many benefits. On the other hand, it may well have some disadvantages, as we hear that many audits are spent these days by junior people sitting in the audit room working on their laptops. And if they have a question to ask of management, they sometimes just send an email and wait for the response. And so this whole question of how is technology impacting the audit process and the effectiveness of an audit, I think is a very interesting one to explore. Can you be really sceptical by just sending emails to management? And is that as good as sitting down with them and asking open questions and seeing their body language and whether they're happy to talk about certain areas? I think is an interesting area. And I'm afraid you won't see anything of that in auditing standards or in the ISAs. Process at the firm level, quite a long list here. And it's not so dissimilar from the material in ISQC1, but there's more on the softer side of things. And you'll see in there is how far does the methodology go to encourage team members to apply skepticism and exercise professional judgment. And we're back into these computerized systems, which I think are really very rigid, and they don't really provide much flexibility for auditors to think about the subject of audit more broadly and to follow their instincts. And then at the national level, again, the middle one there is, do audit inspection groups, do audit regulators think about these broader concepts of audit quality when they're doing their inspections? So there's a lot in the audit quality framework dealing with inputs and processes, and I was highly criticised that the book was much too long, and in order to get a little bit shorter, we moved much of the detail of that information into appendix. So the book looks shorter, but the reality is it's just as long because it's the details in the appendix. The outputs, and we've talked a little bit about these already, the audit reports, the one-page true and fair view fairly presents. There's some quite interesting work going on within IAASB at the moment, and elsewhere. The PCAOB are doing the same in order to try and lengthen the audit report and to get some additional information in there about key or critical audit matters. And I think this very day the standards are going to be finalised in IAASB for that, and they will apply for 2016, I think. And it'll be quite interesting to see whether these longer audit reports help audit quality in a broader sense. I think they should do. In some countries, and I'm thinking in particular of the UK, the entity is also producing some quite important information, and that's the reports on audit committees and the work that they've done on the effectiveness of the external audit. And one of the interesting dynamics, I think, at least in the UK in future years, is how that audit committee report will interact with the key audit matters described in the audit report. Will they duplicate each other, or will they combine in some way to tell a fuller story of audit quality? And at the bottom there, we've got reports from audit regulators, and on the next page, we've also got reports from audit regulators. And I think there is evolving practice here. I think nearly all countries produce some sort of an aggregated report on the health of audit in country X. And that may be a little bit helpful. Some countries are also publishing reports on individual audit firms. And you'll certainly see in the UK a report on KPMG, PwC, Ernst & Young every year in the public domain. And I think in many ways those are even more useful to users, particularly to audit committees. But there's a third level, and this in many ways I think is the most exciting one, and that's the idea of producing a report on the review of an individual audit. And some countries are doing that, not for public display, but so that that information can be communicated to the audit committee. And again, I'm thinking particularly of Canada and the UK. Increasingly, audit inspectors are starting to talk to audit committees about their perspective of audit quality. And I think that's a rather important dynamic that's happening, and one which may be used in other countries as well. Enough on outputs. Interactions. This is a rather better diagram, I think, to demonstrate the interaction of the interactions between the key stakeholders. And it's interesting, I think, to explore each of these different avenues. And I'm thinking of audit committees, those charged with governance. How do they communicate, if at all, with users? And I've said that in some countries there's something in annual reports, but usually there isn't. How do audit committees communicate with management? That's probably better, but is it effective? Because if it isn't, then the role of the audit committee and what they can do in relation to audit quality is jeopardised to a degree. And what about those charged with governance, audit committees, communication with regulators? And I'm thinking in particular here perhaps of bank regulators. Do they speak to audit committees? So some interesting questions on interactions. And then we're on to the contextual factors, and there's, I think, 10 of them shown on this screen. The idea being that the situation in particular countries can impact financial reporting, and with it audit quality. Starting at, about 9 o'clock, we've got business practices and commercial law. Then 11 o'clock, laws and regulations relating to financial reporting. Things like the law relating to fraud by management can be quite effective in improving financial reporting and therefore the effectiveness of financial reporting, the effectiveness of the audit. Noon, we've got the applicable financial reporting framework, and we comment there on how the frameworks have changed over the years from having an emphasis on reliability, relatively factual information, to more relevant information, which is often more judgmental, and the impact that this has on audit, and the importance of estimates, and how auditors deal with estimates. We've got corporate governance, and I've talked quite a lot about audit committees. We've got information systems. Many companies now are completely dependent on information systems, and it's important, I think, to think about the extent to which the audit addresses those. There's not all that much in auditing standards about how much work should be done on some very important aspects of IT controls, dealing with continuity and so on. We've got some broader cultural factors that apply to accountants and auditors, and some interesting thoughts there about how attitudes towards risk, how attitudes towards transparency, how attitudes towards the hierarchy within organisations can impact behaviour, and in particular professional skepticism. There was some very interesting research I read a few years ago where an academic had compared the work done in Egypt and Australia dealing with fraud on an audit, and it was completely different in the way that subject was addressed. Quite interesting. We've got the financial reporting timetable. We've got the way that the profession attracts and keeps talent, and that's to some degree linked to the next one, the litigation environment in the country. And last but not least, of course, we've got audit regulation, and I think we're beginning to learn that good audit regulation can enhance audit quality, in fact does enhance audit quality. Less good audit regulation, on the other hand, might just be having negative influences, and I think it's something that we need to think very hard about. So that, Henri and Pascal, is the end of my presentation. I hope it's been of interest to you and others that have been kind enough to listen. I think it's got some important potential role in relation to what audit firms do and teach themselves, but I also think that it's got a very useful role in relation to regulation and your work more nationally based. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jon. I'm going to open the floor for more questions, from Brazil, because we are very happy to be connected with you, and a few maybe questions from Washington. I can see you. We also have Warsaw, which is connected. But probably before, Jon, a couple of thoughts. The first one was, what I like about one of your first slides, also you say it's imperfect. It's about, we have an idea of what is a universe. And very often, as you said, we focus just on one aspect of the universe, which is the process. We're talking more about ISA compliance, and maybe the engagement level, that we are talking about all the rest. So maybe if you could just say a few words on the three levels of audit quality. To have a quality system of audit, you really need to address the three levels, right?
For it to be sustainable, I think you do, Pascal. I think you can have an individual audit performed by a very good person in a very bad audit firm. I think you can have that. The question is, how often is that going to be performed? We might aim for 100% success in terms of quality audits. We probably won't get to that. But the further we can get into the 90%, I think the better. And for that, you do need these controls within firms. And you need to have oversight of how those controls are operating. And I think it's of interest to me the balance of time that is being spent by audit inspection groups between looking at those firm-wide controls and the time spent at looking at individual audits. Both are important, but I'd be quite interested to know where the balance of time goes, because probably more work should be done on these firm-wide controls, I would think.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Warsaw to see whether there is a question. Alex?
Thank you, Pascal. If you don't mind, I've got a couple of questions that I would like to ask, and maybe John or others can expand. I'm interested in this idea that it's very difficult how to measure quality, and as we know, quality in many regards is a perception, the perception of quality, because it's not tangible and maybe it's not measurable. But touching on technology, surely we should be able to harness technology to be able to give us some kind of criteria that we could use that would be able to say that we are having a process of continuous improvement, that the annual reports from the regulators clearly indicate that the level of audit quality is rising in the country or rising in the firms. So I'm wondering, shouldn't IFAC or other organisations turn their attention a little bit more to it? I know the French institutes, God bless them, and their oversight are looking specifically at trying to measure on a risk base the quality issue. The other thing I would like to ask is about the question of the people, the human resources. And you mentioned, John, at length about the usual suspects, about your ability to judge, about skepticism, the reward system. But you didn't mention anything about education. On-the-job training is great. Coaching is also great. But we have to have an iterative system that brings that back to others, to a much wider audience. That there is an ability to share. And I don't mean the way like Oprah Winfrey would do it, that we all hug at the end. But we should be able to address the issues in a constructive way, not in a blame culture. And my last question is about the role of the inspection unit. This young man sitting next to me was a member of the inspection unit in Poland. He moved from the dark side over to the light side recently. But the fact of the matter is that we had a meeting with the inspection unit here in Poland yesterday, and they're under very significant budget pressure from the professional body to improve their audit quality. In other words, they want more inspections, more in-depth, greater effectiveness, but at a least cost. Now that is hardly creating the right environment for audit quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and I hope you were as pleased with the result of the Scottish referendum this morning as I was. I won't pursue that any further from your reaction. Interesting question. Thank you very much. And measurement is interesting. I think as the framework shows that there are lots of different elements and therefore lots of different things that would need to be measured if you were to have a perfect picture of audit quality, and some of those probably aren't measurable at all. So I don't know how far, and that's one of the reasons I'm looking forward to seeing the PCOB paper so much as how far we can go with measurement. But I think your other point on measurement was not just perhaps the individual elements, but whether the audit regulators can communicate some sort of trend information on performance. And I think that is a good question. It's probably not IFAC that should be doing that, but a group called IFIAR, who are the international group of independent audit regulators. And if you have the pleasure, as I have, of attending some of their meetings, you would see they're a long, long way away from harmonising the basic systems. And until you do harmonise your basic systems in things like how you grade audits, and indeed whether you do grade audits, I don't think we're going to be in a position where internationally we'll be able to see a picture of improving quality. I think nationally you might be able to do that, and I think we do that a degree in the UK. And I think that the trends that we publish there show that there's been a marginal improvement in audit quality over the years. But even that is fraught with difficulty for a number of reasons. So I wouldn't hold out enormous hope for all that much happening in the near future for measurement of international audit quality. I think your point on education and the sharing of experiences was a very interesting point. I remember when I started first talking about this project Audit Quality, and I think I was in Washington, or I could have been in New York. I was somewhere in the States anywhere, in one of these large groups with lots of people who I didn't really know. There was one silver-haired gentleman who got terribly excited about it, and I subsequently found out that he was the Arthur Andersen legal advisor at the time of Enron. And he said a major failing of the profession is exactly what you say, that there isn't honest appraisal of the failures in order to see what can be learnt from it. And he did a sort of comparison with the situation in the airline industry, where if there's ever a crash of an aeroplane, the investigators are all over the place and they understand what went wrong and action is taken to do it. And he said this is the major failing of the whole system of auditing. There isn't this openness. And of course, one of the reasons for that is probably litigation and so on. But even despite that, he was encouraging us more to do more. There's one of the bullet points in the framework which I didn't talk very much about, and it's called root cause analysis. And it's an attempt to pick up exactly that point, Alex. It's an attempt to say, let's explore what went wrong, the root cause of what went wrong, and let's try and feed that back to standard setters, but much more broadly to other people who can do something about it. And it's interesting to me that this group of international audit inspectors, IFIAR, are working on root cause analysis, and I think there's some useful work going on in the States on that as well. And so it'll be interesting to see the way that that develops and whether the useful information comes out of it or not. So the point has been noted, and I think there's some useful things happening on it. Quite how far they go, I don't really know. And then the budget pressure, there's all sorts of budget pressures, aren't there? There's pressure on audit firms to do an audit for less. And one of the things that I know is happening in the UK is that that's happening every year in a more worrying fashion. And that one of our fears is that with increased rotation of audit firms, or at least retendering of audit firms, that's going to make that even worse, because every time there's a retender, the audit fee will fall. And firms respond by doing less work, and that can't be right for audit quality. And then I think, as you were saying, there's also pressure on the oversight boards to do less work inspecting audit quality. And that's worrying as well. I suppose we need to make a distinction between efficiency and effectiveness, and just maybe there are efficiency opportunities in all organisations, But I would be very sorry to hear that the effectiveness of the oversight function is being put under pressure. But then I would ask myself, well, where is the government? If it's the accountancy bodies putting the pressure on the oversight boards, well, where is independent inspection? It shouldn't be the accountancy bodies. It should be the Ministry of Finance or whatever the sponsoring organisation is, it would seem to me, but perhaps I'm being naive.
Thank you, John. Maybe Brazil, if you have any question, it's just time to ask.
Yes, we just have one question. One of the pressures that we see for audit firms is that is a pressure for costs. And even about your speaking, I was thinking that even the government, there is an incentive to reduce costs. Basically, auditing firms are now hired, at least here in our environment in Brazil, by a bidding process where they actually reward the prices, and basically the company who gives the least price, the minimum price, will probably earn the bidding process and will provide the service. And one of the issues that raised for us here at WorldBank and in general is that how people are evaluating this system about the quality and the quality perspective, right? Because they're reducing the costs as much as they can, and how they still maintain the same quality that it's necessary to perform a work like this. So I was figuring out how the quality system or the standards could actually try to go against this when there is all this environment, this context that brings same firms reduce costs, otherwise you're not going to provide us services. How we can introduce the quality in a system like this to promote initiatives to say, hey, we need better service. That's just one point that we have.
It's a very good question, and one of the more difficult parts of writing the audit quality framework was trying to deal with this issue of costs. And the bit that we agreed on was that audit committees have a very important role to play, because the audit committee is often in the position, for a listed company at least, of either agreeing the audit fee or advising the board. And that the more the auditors can work with the audit committee and the more the audit committee can understand the work that needs to be done, the more hope, and I think it's only a hope, that we will be able to make sure that the firms are paid a fair amount. And for the audit committee to do this, they can very usefully be in touch with investors. I've actually seen quite a lot of investors over recent years. As an auditor, I never saw an investor. There's very little link at all. But in recent years, I've seen more of investors, and investors are furious about the downward pressure on audit fees. They say audit fees to us are completely immaterial in amount. For a large listed company, they may be £1 million, they may be a bit more. But they say a massive failure of a major international company can be hundreds of millions of pounds for us. We really need an effective audit. It's important to us as investors, and almost we don't mind what we pay. Not entirely, but that's almost what they're saying. And the message just isn't getting through, unfortunately. Sometimes audit committees hear that, sometimes they don't. And the firms aren't hearing it. The firms are competing amongst themselves for market share or whatever it is, and the price and the quality keeps on falling. And that's one of the reasons why, at least in the UK, investors are so angry, because they're just not, their views aren't being heard. And it's a very frustrating one, and I don't know quite what can be done. Perhaps the answer is different in one country to another. But if only investors could have more say on the audit, and just maybe this link in the audit report with key audit matters might just make it a little bit more helpful, we're just not going to get the right answer on fees.
Can I follow up on this question? Because I think that the pressure on the audit fee comes also from the fact that the decisive factor is the price, whom to choose when you do the tendering procurement process. So, and one of the client countries recently asked me, how do we deal with advising the companies to deal with quality during the procurement process? Because it's basically the company comes and says we're a good quality company, and another company comes also says we're a good quality company because we are great, we're just great, you know. And probably there are some elements of good staff or time, structure of the staff in the audit engagement, etc., etc. Another advice which I gave to people also is, look at the results of the audit inspections of each individual firms, and then there is a judgment you can make of the audit quality. But maybe there was something more systematic in this area, how the companies should approach the quality when they select the auditor.
Well, Andrea, I would say the answers are in this book. And the starting point, if I was the company, would go to that experience line, the experience input, and I'd say, how many hours is the audit engagement partner going to contribute to the work? And I would think, and I don't know, that one of the measures that the PCAOB might have in mind might just be an analysis of time and the level of experience that goes on the audit team. That's just one. There's many other things that I would ask, but that would be just one.
We're following up on Andrea's question and also the question from Brazil. I mean, I think this is a really big point for us. In a number of the countries where we are working, we are trying to help the regulatory authorities and others create high-quality financial reporting and high-quality auditing where there really isn't a market demand for it, where the financial information really isn't being used. So for the company, when it's thinking about which auditor it's going to hire and how much it cares about quality, if it knows that its bank is not going to give it better credit terms, or if it knows that there either is no securities market, or that if it does an issuance that the share price is probably not going to be heavily influenced by its financial reporting, then there's a great difficulty in getting them to care about quality. And I guess in the end, what part of our project here is we're effectively hoping to create a product that will induce its own demand, that effectively will help countries to improve their financial reporting, improve auditing, and as a result of that, maybe banks will start using the financial reporting to make credit decisions, and maybe securities markets will develop to the point where they're connected in a more realistic way to the financial reporting. But do you think this project and the audit quality work that you've done and that other bodies are doing is something that may help push this process through where financial information actually starts being used by decision makers?
And I honestly don't know. You're absolutely right, Jerry, that the starting point has to be how important is financial information. Auditing can only really add to the credibility of that financial information. It can't, I don't think, create the demand for financial information. But just maybe, I suppose, if some countries aren't using financial information just because they don't trust it, maybe the two can work together. But I suspect it's going to be a long process. And I don't know in the countries you're talking about the degree to which foreign investors might have some influence over it. Maybe that might speed things up. I don't know. If it's merely a national use, I would be pessimistic, I think.
Jon, in your discussions when you were with the board and particularly leading the project on audit quality, and we remember we had you twice presenting Jim came in 2011, you came in 2012, but we certainly looked very closely, actually, Natalie and I, we were discussing the audit framework, but an older version. But in those discussions, to what extent did you discuss something that I would call audit literacy, which means the stakeholders' ability to understand what is an audit and to influence? And for instance, to answer the question of Andre, I would say normally in my experience, I would expect that the financial staff, the chief financial officer, the controller, and now I would say probably the audit committee, because that's how it works nowadays, should be able to recognize, organize the process in such a way that they get sufficient information to be able to decide. And you said, Andre, rightfully, who is going to be involved, number of hours. That's a promise. Then, of course, you have to hope that the promise will be fulfilled, but also a kind of credential, industry expertise. But that requires audit expertise. And then also, what specific approach will you put in place? Show me your ability to understand my business, where the risks are, even if you're not necessarily within an incumbent auditor. This is what I call audit literacy, which I think is missing in a lot of jurisdictions, in a lot of countries. Is that something that you've identified? And then, if so, I guess, is this something to provide audit literacy?
I fear it probably isn't, Henri. I think it's a good question you ask. I suppose we probably think we know what an audit is, although even if we sat down and wrote our own little analysis, we might well find differences even just around this table and within the different group. But the further you go away from people that have been involved in auditing, there's an enormous expectation gap, is the phrase that's traditionally been used as to what an audit is and what an audit isn't. And we heard only yesterday, I think, Pascal, or was it the day before, probably on Wednesday, that there was a need in one particular country to try to educate people and to limit their expectations as to what an audit was. I think the context might have been one of banking regulators expecting the banking returns to be audited and so on. So I fear this isn't really an answer to what is an audit, nor is it an answer to what is the value of an audit, which is another question that some people have answered. We just tried to focus on ourselves on trying to answer the third question, what is a quality audit? All three of them interrelate to a degree, but I think they're actually different questions.
Thank you, John. Before continuing this conversation in Vienna, I would like to also ask our colleagues in Washington whether they would have any question.
Thank you for the presentation, and maybe more than a question, a comment following on what just Henri asked. I really much like these two concepts of the audit quality versus the quality of the audit, but what this brings us to think is that this really goes beyond the audit profession. So whatever we have as standards, whatever we have as guidance, it is coming to the PAOs, the audit firms, or whomever is involved in the audit profession. But it seems that the real challenge beyond that is how to create the demand with the rest of the stakeholders at the government level, at the regulators level, to demand audit quality and understand this as a system that may need to be set up in a country. And I think that's where we are struggling the most, because auditors will always, I think it's expected that we will all agree on the importance of having quality audit, but how to engage the other stakeholders and how to bring them to the level that they are also create the environment to start building these systems in the country. I think it's the challenge we have.
Well, thank you for the observation, and I'd agree absolutely with it. I think it's a very good point, and I don't have a magic solution to it, other than discussion might be a good starting point, and you need an excuse to have a discussion. And I was rather hoping that the publication of the Audit Quality Framework would do that. And in some countries, I'm aware that that is happening, that forum or of colloquia or events are being organised, including the different stakeholders, and they're talking about the framework. And by doing so, yes, maybe we're starting to get a little bit of traction and some areas of cooperation and improvement. So there's not a perfect answer. You're absolutely right that there's a lot of people that need to do a lot of things to create the perfect environment.
Thank you, John. I think one of the work that we're doing also in Vienna is we have a discussion between the auditors and the regulators to understand what they can communicate and how they can help each other to do a better job. So we've done a big study about that, and we have a significant amount of materials which is a response of the regulators, and we will keep everybody posted on that one. I'd like to maybe give my thoughts about the framework and how I approached it. I thought it would be interesting for three different levels. But the first level is, I know that our fiduciary colleagues are looking at audit quality when they are looking at audit firms as to whether they can do audit for the project of the bank or not. And very often there's a look at the methodologies in ISA compliance, and there's a broader view of that. We've seen that this was only the process. ISA was only a process, but there was much more to it. And I think that, as not as a solution, but as an additional element, I thought that would be interesting. It's also interesting and we've seen that when we were in Prague yesterday, discussing with the public oversight, who said, well, everything should be ISA compliant. And they have an over-reliance on the compliance with ISA, and they think that ISA is solving everything. And therefore, if you're capable to adopt ISAs, to educate people with ISAs, and if you're capable to enforce ISA compliance, you did it all. But we know that this is broader than that. And therefore, this framework helps a little bit to give a broader view and a sense of the universe. And I thought that would be interesting for us. There is, I think, many other topics. We talked a little bit about audit committees. I think we were doing also some work on audit committees. But there is also the problem of the capacity of the audit committee. It's why we would expect that audit committee would be a magic solution in all our countries, where we know that actually they don't know what an audit is. So I'm not sure how we can address that. Henri, you want to say something?
Well, how much time do we have? Can we ask more questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How much more time do we have?
I think we have up to 45 minutes, but I would aim to finish in 15 to 20 minutes. Any question? Yes, absolutely, please.
I would like to ask a question, if you don't mind. I really enjoyed Henri's explanation of audit literacy. I thought it was a great explanation. And coupled with Jerry's comment about demand-driven financial information, I don't think we should be misled by the current review of what should be a typical audit report. In other words, for very much UK or other countries, short-form report to move to a long-form report is somehow going to solve or move partially towards solving audit literacy or demand-driven financial information, because the experience here in Poland, where they have, by statutory regulation, long-form reporting, the largest bank in Poland, for example, the audit opinion is on 1 page. The audit report lasts for 75 pages. Now, that is giving you some kind of financial information that could be alleged to be demand-driven. My view is that the auditor in Poland looks at that as being, the longer the report, the higher the fee.
Perhaps maybe to build on what Alex said, because I had a question on audit reports, and I wonder during the project, if you looked at the French experience with this earlier attempt to do what's not a long-form report, but have the auditor put on paper what is the key audit matters. I mean, it was not exactly the way it's proposed by the IAASB. And I know the French body, CNCC, published a report that sort of had mixed reviews because obviously they couldn't, they had to say that it produced some values and maybe it did produce some values. But it was mentioned actually in the request for information for the new ISA 700. And I guess this is a very specific question, the merits and the benefits and the success of the French experience, but more broadly, your hope that having a better output with an expanded audit report will actually, help achieve audit quality, because there's been a lot of skepticism around that.
And perhaps I overstated the importance of the new audit report, and apologies to Alex and you, Henri, if I did do that. I think it's a part of the jigsaw, a possible part, but there are many, many other things that need to be done to achieve audit quality. I think additional transparency will be good because it'll drive more engagement between the auditor and the audit committee. I think that's for sure. And it may drive more engagement between the investor and the auditor. And I think that would be good. And that engagement probably isn't going to come just from reading the audit report. It's going to come from people reading the audit report and then attending the annual general meeting or some other mechanism and saying, what did you mean by that? What was the real problem? So I think it just could. I don't want to say it will, and I certainly wouldn't say it was a panacea to all problems, but it just might help this link between the auditor and the investor. And if we can improve that, then just maybe the link with audit fees might get a little bit better.
Yeah, I'd like to complement a little bit what was just said. You referred, Alex, to this long-form report and saying that it was very long indeed, maybe fee-driven. There was a conversation that we had with people from the Central Bank of Belgium and auditors of Belgian banks. And they said, well, they didn't, that's a feature of their system. They don't like it that much. Why they don't like it that much? Because they say, well, mostly it's cut and paste from the last year. Yeah. So the value is actually not much that. But they said what we value above all is the annual interaction face-to-face that we have with the regulator from one side and with the auditor and his managers on the other side, which was a frank discussion about what are the risks, what were the key issues in the audit and how they approached it. A lot of things are in discussions. If we broaden a little bit the topic, we were talking about audit software and people looking at their computers all day and sending message, the e-audit. A lot of information that are gathered, and we all know that being a bit older than young auditors, is through discussions and through information. I wouldn't say that you learn a lot of things at the coffee machine, but actually you do learn a lot of things with talking with people who are in their operations, with people who are in finance, but not only with the accountant that draws the financial statements. So conversation are important. In the same vein, when there is a tender process, one of the most important things that the audit committee does is to interview the auditor and its team and his team to make sure that beyond the proposal, which is nice and glossy, they have a good response to some challenging questions that could be asked. Of course, it requires that the audit committee has some clout. Though that will be all from my side. I've seen that in Brazil there was some question. I've seen a bit of movement. Was there any?
Yeah, sorry, just one question. You mentioned during your presentation the importance of professional skepticism, and generally the view is that the debate with audit firms being so reliant on the audit fees as well as the non-audit fees, that the higher the fee, the lower the skepticism. And one of the suggestions that had been made, that I know that the UK didn't implement in the US as well, was the mandatory auditor rotations or the fixed terms. So I just wanted to get maybe your views or your perspective on that.
Well, my personal view on rotation, for what it's worth, is I think it is likely to do considerable damage because of the pressure on audit fees, and that I've always thought that enough rotation was achieved by rotating the audit engagement partner every 5 years, and I thought that was probably good enough. But clearly more important, people than me have much stronger views on the importance of rotation. It was quite an issue within Europe over the last 3 or 4 years. But coming back to skepticism, I think things can be done in that area. It's something that audit inspectors can look at and are increasingly looking at, and that's having a virtuous effect on audit firms. I think bit by bit it's feeding back into their training and hopefully into their culture. More importantly, I think audit committees can also encourage the auditor to be more sceptical, provided there's this proper dialogue with them on a timely basis. So again, that's another angle that we can work on. But I do think that there is a danger that as audit fees go down, firms will be less and less sceptical, and the value of an audit will be reduced even further.
Yeah, I would like to add maybe that in the regulation that has been issued by the European Union, there is a very definitive list of non-audit services that are completely prohibited, and this is very clear. So there has been a choice to name non-audit services, in addition to another provision that caps the audit fees to a certain amount on a rolling basis. So I think as a percentage of the total fees. So that is also one of the response that has been brought recently by regulators.
I think I would add also that, to the question that the colleague from Brazil asked, I think we know that for an audit to be effective, you have to have the ability to identify the key risk, assess the effectiveness, whether internal controls is there, address residual risk the appropriate way, but also the willingness to report issues and to, put, in a way, management on the spot, or, force them to report bad news to the shareholders. And actually, you made me realize that the financial statements are indeed, to some extent, the output of the audit process, because normally, if they should reflect some adjustments or improvements that the auditors actually I haven't quite identified that as clearly as you put it. So, but I think skepticism is, I think we would see it more in terms of the ability. Are you really able to see that you're being told a nice story? But it's true that there's a little bit of an element of willingness also, and I think there's also the familiarity is an issue. I think rotation, the value, for instance, of partner rotation is precisely to eliminate a little bit of the excess familiarity. But what's interesting is that, being French, as maybe is obvious with my accent, we value very much in France something that has to do with the interaction, in a way, at the engagement level, which is the interaction between the audit partner and the management and the audit committee. The quality of this interaction, in a way, the trust that exists for instance, for an audit partner to know that he's going to be able to convey a difficult message and somebody is going to hear it, and maybe this will be the best outcome of the discussion, which is that a difficult decision will be made, but will not force the auditor to actually call the regulator or suggest to call the regulators as. So I think familiarity is an issue, but you want an open and a trusting relationship trust, I think, between, so it's trust but verify if you want, which I think we borrowed from Russian folklore. So I think there's a lot of elements of subtleties that are out there that I think checklist, software, standards, the 36 standards will not really completely reduce or help. But I think clearly since from Europe, we're very happy that we've overcome this long protracted discussion on whether we need to have audit rotation. We will have rotation, but after 20 years, so I mean, 20 years is a pretty long time, so I think I've been told that in Brazil, in some cases, recently I had a discussion, you may have cases where you would have rotation after 3 years. That is, I would think, not to use too strong a word, but it's very dangerous. I was going to say something even stronger, because you really destroy a lot of intangible capital, you really create systemic risk. Sorry for the long, but I think we had a nice discussion. I would like to hear, I mean, we had Lourdes. I know our colleagues in Washington are working on a number of ROSC. Enrico and Fabien, not to put you on the spot, but we're very much happy to hear your views and your questions. And also our colleagues, of course, in Brasilia, if you have any more questions.
Hi, thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. And actually, I wanted to go a little bit off topic because in the back of my mind, one of the things that you had mentioned was the quality of the staff that needed to be present as an input for the quality of the audit, which of course we all know the quality of the staff is important within the industry. And that kind of in the back of my mind, but the question about education and curriculum at the university level. And how can we influence that in some ways to ensure that we get the quality of the staff at the entry level and that we get this training of skepticism, if you wish?
Golly, well, that's a very good and a very difficult question. I don't really know how it's done, but I would agree with you that it's got to be done because it's part of that bit about making the profession attractive for the best and brightest people, isn't it? Making sure that the initial training is high. Of course, the initial training model varies from one country to another. And in some countries there is an accounting and auditing qualification which is necessary. In some countries not. In my country, the UK, you can study French at university or physics and so on. So it's not necessarily at the university that it's all got to be done. It might be done slightly later on. So I don't have an answer. I agree it's an important thing to be done. But I would say that one of our greatest supporters in producing this little booklet on audit quality forum was the US academic community. I couldn't have been happier with the letter we received from them. They spent a lot of time providing input to this, which was very helpful, but it was their support for working on this project that I found the most fulfilling, and the fact that they said that this is going to be really helpful in them helping teach their undergraduates about the totality of audit quality. So I hope in just a small way, at least in the States, this might have made a little bit of a contribution. But your point is a very good one. There's a million more things that need to be done.
I think I would just want to volunteer maybe also a suggestion. This is something very much we discuss with academics, and it's the nexus between the professional world and the academic world. Can we through our engagement encourage the academics to open a little bit the gates of the university to the professional world, to bring the skepticism, to bring the business acumen that you need. I mean, there's a way to convey bad news, to convince. The auditing is also, to a large extent, is about interactions and convincing that this is not right, and making the case and trying to and showing that ultimately it's good. It's good to be transparent and not to. I mean, of course, in many circumstances, the numbers. I mean, there's earnings management that takes place. But I think this is critical, and I think on this question of the attractiveness of the profession, which is clearly a concern with all the regulation, the pressure on the fees, a bit the bad rap that auditors have had to some extent, to a large extent, I think unfairly. There's this element of pride. I mean, instilling some pride in embracing a career that is very useful, that in fact also adds value. And I know that this is something that a lot of people would, maybe even object to say that an independent audit would add value. I personally am convinced that it is, if it's well done. I don't know to what extent this was a topic of discussion. So where do we want to? So
I think we,
want to continue this conversation.
I think if everybody agrees, is there any other question? That's number one. I'll have probably 5 seconds to see whether there's any other questions. And then what I propose is actually that this was a good occasion for us to have a discussion with you. And I hope that we'll have other opportunities to have this discussion and other topics and other excellent people that we can invite to speak about interesting topic for you. I'd like to conclude by a little story. We spent a bit of time with Jon, and Jon knows that I like little stories. I was at a concert very recently, and I had the chance to be on the first row, and there was a violinist who was playing really greatly. He had a Stradivarius, and it was absolutely fantastic. And a person that was sitting a few seats next to me went to greet that person and said, "Oh, your technique is absolutely incredible." And the soloist said, "There is a bit much than technique." So I think it's a bit like audit. There's a bit much than either. There's a bit of an art to auditing, and it's to open one's ears and one's mind to these other elements that we did that discussion today. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jon, for championing. That was a word I was trying to use earlier on, audit quality, and I hope that we will work quite a bit with you. And thank you for your colleagues for coming on a Friday. It's not always, Friday is not always easy. So thank you for being there. Have a good day. And see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.